The race to save the Romanovs covers a very, very specific period in the story of Russia's last imperial family. That is, from the moment of Nicholas's abdication in March 1917 to their murders the following July in Ekaterinburg in 1918. And it particularly focuses on what happened behind the scenes. So it's not so much the story of them, although of course they come into the narrative, but of what everyone beyond, in Europe and beyond, was trying to do to try and help save them or rescue them or find some diplomatic means to get them out. So it's the story of the failed asylum attempts and also the abject failure of several half-baked monarchist attempts to storm wherever they were being held and free them. Having written already 2 books about the Romanovs, first of all, the last 2 weeks of their lives in Ekaterinburg, which is a very tight scenario, and then a book on their domestic life based around the 4 sisters, the 4 daughters of the Tsar. I hadn't really intended to write another book, but something kept niggling away at me constantly, and that was everywhere I went talking about the Romanovs, even reading blogs and articles on the web, constantly repeated the same thing again and again, which was it was all the fault of King George V for not saving them. He had betrayed them. He hadn't galloped into their rescue like some knight on a white charger. And it's always struck me, first of all, that there had to be far more to this story than just that. And also, if you know Russia and the geography of Russia, it doesn't take much to realize how difficult in terms of the geography and the logistics it would be to get them out of Russia. So I felt I really passionately wanted to put the microscope on that last part of the story, those last few months. And I felt that the time had come to challenge a lot of very knee-jerk received thinking about what had happened with regard to the British offer of asylum that failed and various other initiatives. I felt the time had come to really explore the evidence that had been cited in support of these various aspects of the story, because it very quickly struck me as I started digging into the story that there's some very, very faulty thinking behind a lot of the arguments for that part of the story, and that one really had to try and go back to absolutely the grassroots to actually look at what documentary evidence there was. And more importantly, I felt it was essential to look for more evidence, because there are some very unsubstantiated, flimsy claims made about what happened. So that was my self-imposed objective, was to somehow try and get to the truth of what went on. I think my main objective with the book, although I'm by no means set out to exonerate George V, and I don't, but I think it's very, very important, and when you read the book and you look at how complex the situation was, I think it's very important to apportion blame equally among several players, because it wasn't all down to King George's loss of nerve and his worry about, public outcry if he had the Romanovs here. It was an incredibly complicated situation. It was partly political. There were also clashes within the different European royal families about whether they should or shouldn't help them get out. There were then the monarchists in Russia trying to do their own thing to get the Romanovs out. There was all the political difficulty for the provisional government in Russia of trying to evacuate the Romanovs, constantly coming up against the very hardline Petrograd Soviet, who absolutely were adamant that they could not be sent out of Russia and that Nicholas, and probably Alexandra too, must face trial and almost certainly execution. So it was a much more complex situation, and I felt we had to look at many different aspects of that to see that many, many people in their and circumstances in their different ways were to blame for the failure of saving the family. I've done my absolute best to search and scour for anything, any new material about what went on. So many of the books in existence that touch on the end of the Romanov story, they all just say, oh, well, it was all George V's fault, end of story. And they don't try and look at the bigger picture. And it's too knee-jerk, it's too easy to just say, oh, it was the king's fault because he changed his mind. And I felt that that was very pat and based on very little research and very little attempt to look at the bigger picture. So that was my passion about doing this book, was to say, come on, you can never blame it all on one person. And to a certain extent, I think George V has been scapegoated. And it was time to open that up and see that blame also belonged at several other people's doors. The trouble with the Romanov story, when you look in general at a lot of books on the subject, is people get very emotional, very passionate, very anguished about the terrible tragedy of what happened in Ekaterinburg, and particularly the hideous murder of 5 beautiful innocent children. I think that has so struck a nerve with people. They get so impassioned about how awful it was that it's very hard for them to perhaps stand back a bit and be a bit more objective. And so that ties in with the ease with which people have jumped to blame someone. Someone has to be to blame. It's got to be someone's fault that they all died. And it is a very emotive subject, and one has to treat it carefully and with respect and with compassion, because there are people out there, particularly the deeply Russian Orthodox believers, who revere the Romanovs, and they are saints in the Orthodox calendar. So one has to take into account their deep sensitivities to this story and the murders, but also say, come on, we have to be objective. Let's just take a step back and look at the evidence. And what I wanted to do is be quite dispassionate and really focus on the evidence. Oh, don't tell me about Anastasia. That's another reason why I wanted to do the book. I can tell you, almost without exception, every single talk I ever do on the Romanovs, I get asked 2 questions. One is, why did George betray them? Or why was it all George's fault? And the other one is, did Anastasia get away? And this is in defiance of all the DNA evidence, the scientific tests, all the attempts over and over again to close down the conspiracy theory angle of this story. It's because I think partly it's so awful, this murder of the children, that people cling to the hope that maybe someone survived it. And all the time the Bolsheviks wouldn't properly admit to having killed them all. It left a window of opportunity open for false claimants to appear, beginning with Anna Anderson. And then there was a long period until 2007 where 2 sets of remains were missing of Maria and Alexey. And all the time those 2 sets were not found. Again, the conspiracy theorists could say, well, they escaped. There is a terrible need, I think, for closure on this story now, for acceptance, for reconciliation, for forgiveness. And I think it will be a very profound moment for the Russian people in Russia this year, much more so than anywhere else, because they have been tormented by this idea of the murder of innocent children. Well, it depends whether you're a monarchist or a Romanov fan. There are some in Russia who would like to see a monarchy restored. I don't think that will ever happen. I think its significance for Russians is that they need closure now. There has been too much oxygen of publicity over the last 100 years given to all these crazy claimants, conspiracy theorists. People have popped up all over the world claiming to be one or any of the members of the family. Anastasia, of course, is the one who's had the most claimants, but I think it's time, please, let them rest in peace. You know, please, let's just put the full stop to the story now. Well, one thing I've noticed in all the years I've been lecturing about my history work, writing, is people love knowing how you do it, how you work it out, how you find your evidence. They actually are very interested in the process. And because I knew that this was going to be a heavily evidence-based book, rather than a straight narrative like Four Sisters was, I thought I had to find a different way of writing it. And having discussed it with my editor at Hutchinson and with my American editor, I decided that what I would do is interpolate in the text small sections where I explain how I think a document was faulty, or I found something new that contradicted prior thinking, or explain where things weren't in the place where they shouldn't be, and generally show my thought processes as I looked at the evidence and discarded some things and found other things that were new and quite revealing. And so I'm hoping the readers will find that, seeing a glimpse inside the writer-historian's process, of interest. One of the major elements of the research I felt compelled about was that not enough effort had been made, certainly in English language sources, to look at Scandinavian sources, to look at the other royals of Europe, not just George V, but the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Danes. But most important of all was the Spanish element, because I knew, and anyone who knows anything about the Romanovs knows, that fairly late in the story, King Alfonso of Spain made very passionate representations on behalf of the family, sadly was initiating all kinds of pleas and offers to give them asylum, actually when they were being murdered. And he too had appealed to the Vatican. The Vatican came into the frame as well. But it was too late. This was all happening in August 1918. But what I wanted to do was take a closer look at Alfonso, because what I did discover through hard work was that he had been engaged with the problem and with the trying to help the Romanovs from the very moment the Tsar abdicated. So I've expanded a great deal on Alfonso's role. I've looked at all the different political pressures faced by the various Scandinavian relatives about whether they could or couldn't take the Romanovs in. I had a lot of research done for me in Canada in the Hudson's Bay archive about rumours that a house was going to be constructed at Murmansk as part of a British evacuation plan. I looked in much more detail at Foreign Office records and discussions about the whole process of the asylum issue and the king losing his nerve, and all the discussions going back and forth between London and the British ambassador in Petrograd. So there were lots of parts of the story where a normal source would say, well, this happened, this memo was sent. And I think, well, was that all? And then I've dug and dug and dug, and I've looked for other things, other bits of tangential or additional evidence, documentation that give a clearer picture of what went on. Well, I've been gathering material on the Romanovs for the last 10 years, so I had some material already, but it was a very intensive research period because I decided quite late that I was going to do this book, and I had to. I mean, the optimum time for publishing it is obviously for the anniversary. I had to turn it around very, very fast. And so I did the research inside a year, and I wrote it in about 9 months. Well, I started writing about the Romanovs absolutely, totally by accident. I had never taken an interest in them particularly because I always had this fairly knee-jerk dismissive response. Oh, that saccharine, you know, chintzy stuff, pretty girls in big hats and, you know, frocks and all that imperial grandeur and bling didn't appeal to me. And I owe it to a former agent of mine who, when I was searching around for a new book idea, he said, well, you're a Russian speaker, you're a Russian specialist, why don't you do the Romanovs? And I said, oh no, it doesn't appeal to me, it's too, chintzy royal biography is just not my cup of tea. He said, well, go away and look at it. And actually, once I got into the story and started looking at them not as royal personalities, but as an ordinary family, and once I began getting into the dynamic of that family, of their love and support for each other, of their deeply, profoundly Russian Orthodox faith, I began to admire them as a family, particularly Nicholas as the most hands-on father any child could wish to have. But really I fell in love with the four girls, who I felt had been completely marginalised and just been the pretty set dressing to the more dramatic story of their parents and the haemophiliac brothers. So I kind of was sucked into the story. And once I got into it, there were so many things about it that fascinated me. And so here I am 10 years on and 3 books later. In terms of certain historical subjects, very definitely. The one thing I've always felt is that there's been this assumption that men write the big boy subjects like war and violence and revolution and stuff like that, and men writers cover the big historical personalities like Stalin or even Lenin. And one of the first things I did in my earlier book about Lenin in exile was I thought, well, isn't it about time we had a woman's perspective on a big male historical figure? And I did feel at times women historians have tended to gravitate to female subjects, you know, endless books on Tudor queens and mistresses and lovers of famous men. And the women are always the adjuncts to the much bigger male personalities. And so I thought, well, come on, we ought to have more women writing about the male subjects and actually taking it on and offering a woman's point of view. So when I did Lenin in Exile, I wasn't so much interested in the politics. I was fascinated in his private domestic life with his wife and his mother-in-law and his mistress and all the women in the party who plodded around and served the cause. And I just think that a woman writer can offer a different angle on big male subjects. This is my treasured possession, and I bought it to commemorate completing 3 books on the Romanovs. It's a piece designed by an American costume jeweller, very well known, who designed mock Cartier and Fabergé jewellery for people like Elizabeth Taylor and I think even Wallis Simpson. And I know the jewellery maker who makes these wonderful one-off necklaces, and she had acquired this piece and made the necklace and the earrings to match. And as soon as I saw it on her website, I said, I have got to have that Romanov necklace to remember my long love affair with them by. This is the Russian Imperial Eagle. So it's the great iconic image. And for me, every time I look at it now, I shall remember 10 very happy years going through their story with them.